The most that you might have is a sales comparison approach to see what other similar vacant lots have sold for in the area over the past 6 to 12 months. But even that doesn't exist a lot of times.
Welcome to the Freedom Point Real Estate Podcast, where we talk about creating more time freedom through passive real estate investing. Passive investing in real estate challenges conventional investment wisdom. We are passionate about learning and sharing resources with others who are ready to transform their investing mindset. Quick disclaimer as always, I am not a CPA, I am not an attorney or a financial advisor. This is not financial advice, not telling you or anyone else what to do. The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are provided for education and informational purposes only and are not necessarily the views of my employer, ADP. I'm glad you're here. Now let's dig in. All right, welcome back, Freedom Point Podcast listeners. Thank you again for jumping into another episode of the Freedom Point. I am your host, Jeremy Dyer, and I have an amazing guest with me today, Seth Williams. Seth, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jeremy, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate your time and being willing to jump in today to talk about the topic of land investing.
Yeah, of course.
So with that said, if you wouldn't mind just kind of opening up the episode with a little bit more about, Seth, what you're currently up to now, what you're focused on, what your plans are for the future, et cetera.
Sure. Yeah, totally. Well, I usually kind of start these conversations with like the backstory of how I got into real estate and why land of all things. So for me, it was way back in like 2009 is when I really started going after the land specifically. And the first time I heard about land, I was like a lot of people where I was just like, what? Land? I don't get it. Why would you do that? That makes no sense. And I understand why people think that. And the reason it's not making sense to them is because they don't understand a very key component, and that is where and how to buy land at a very, very, very cheap price. And once you can do that, a lot of things become possible. It's kind of like if you were able to go out and buy a car that was normally worth $20,000, but you could pay $5,000 for it, and then turn around and list it for sale and sell it for $15,000. Or maybe pay $10,000 for it and sell it for its actual market value. It's a very similar thing. We're just doing that with land. And when I first discovered this in 2009, I had spent a couple of years up to that point trying and failing really hard trying to do this with houses. So I would spend just hundreds of hours scouring the MLS trying to find houses I could flip or rent out. And the numbers never worked. And then the big crash happened in 2008. And then the numbers didn't work, but in a different direction. I could get them cheap, but there was a lot of vacancies and it's just sort of a weird time. But with vacant land, I was able to basically find a lot of private landowners that didn't want their land anymore and make them really low offers. At the time, I don't think you can do this necessarily anymore, but at the time I could make them offers for 10% of their property's value, maybe 20%. And pretty regularly get those offers accepted and buy these things for cash. And, I never needed loans for anything. And I didn't even need a real estate agent to do it. I could just buy these things, get the deed after paying cash, and then list it for sale on a place like Craigslist and sell it within a couple of weeks, making 2 to 3 to 4 times more than what I paid for it. And it was really awesome. And after, struggling for such a long time, not being able to find deals on houses, in a market where I could make full asking price offers for people and they would still say no because they wanted more than that. It was such a breath of fresh air to find land where I could get all the deals I wanted to at prices I could make a lot of money on. And the other beautiful thing was that because it was just land, there's no people living in the properties, there's no contractors you have to deal with. It was really pretty easy to deal with, and it remains that way to this day. So that's not to say land doesn't have its weird quirks and issues you have to work through, but by and large, I found it's a simpler and lower competition property type to work with.
So you've been at this game, Seth, since 2009. Yeah. To me, it sounds a lot like wholesaling. You're just doing it with land. The challenge, the elephant in the room really is this, and that is, it sounds to me like the strategy is all on the buy, and then how quickly you can exit that land purchase, because there's really no cash flow involved here. And I don't believe there's any, depreciation loss activity. So there's really not
Correct.
a tax benefit here. Am I am
Mhm.
I kind of framing that up
Yeah.
correctly?
Yeah. I mean, there's always caveats. There are different strategies you can pursue within the land niche. Like some people these days are subdividing stuff, and that changes everything. It's basically a different business model than land flipping. But you're right. When we're talking about just buying a property that's really cheap, doing nothing to it, and then reselling it, there's no depreciation write off. There's a big capital gains bill you have to pay. It is all about just making the right decision on the buy side. And usually the harder thing in the land business is waiting for it to get sold. That's usually what happens slower. Whereas with houses, again, depending on the market and the economy at the time, usually it's harder to find the deals and faster to sell them. So land is kind of the opposite. But yeah, you're right. In a lot of ways, land, you know, flipping land, it just kind of mimics what happens with wholesaling houses. And it's actually kind of drifting more in that direction. It used to be that all a land flipper would ever have to do is just send direct mail and they can find all the deals they would ever want. And as it's gotten more competitive in the land space, we're finding ourselves having to do more and more things that house wholesalers have to do with like cold calling and text marketing and ringless voicemail and stuff like that. So it's kind of like trailing where the house game is by like 5 years or so. So
Yeah. So obviously, with this type of a strategy, just like any other real estate investing strategy, as the active investor, you've got to begin with the end in mind, right?
yeah.
So, what does that end typically look like when acquiring land? Who is the buyer typically? Are there specific areas within the local submarket that you live in? Are you restricted to maybe land purchases that are within X amount of miles of where you currently sit, or is this kind of a national type of business?
Yeah. No, all great questions. So, in terms of the geographic area, you can really do this anywhere in the US. There's certain things you can look at each individual market to verify that it's actually going to be a good market to work in, like understanding the, sold to for sale ratio and how many transactions are happening in that county on a given month or year, just to understand, are properties actually selling in this area? Like, do people post them for sale and they just sit there for years, or do they post them for sale and they sell in a matter of days or weeks? Because it definitely does make a difference when you work in a market where land just naturally sells faster. And it usually has a lot to do with the growth of that area. If people are migrating toward that market or away from it, what the building market looks like has a lot to do with how well land is going to sell too. But in terms of what were the other questions you were asking earlier?
Yeah, I mean, there's
Oh yeah, about the beginning with the end in mind, right? About who
yeah,
you,
right. I mean, you got to kind of reverse engineer this because you don't want to
yeah.
acquire a piece of land without knowing that you might be having to sit on this piece of property for the next 20 years, right?
Yep, exactly. So beginning with the end in mind is really everything with land flipping, and it has a lot to do with your ability to understand what that parcel of land is worth. And it can be actually a very tricky thing with vacant land. It's much harder than houses in a lot of cases, because when you look at what a house appraiser needs to know in order to determine the appraised value, they're looking at the sales comparison approach, the cost approach, what would it cost to rebuild that house from the ground up, and the income approach. How much money might that house be earning on an annual basis? That kind of stuff. And with a vacant residential lot, you don't have most of that information. There is no cost to rebuild approach. There is no income approach because it's not making money. The most that you might have is a sales comparison approach to see what other similar vacant lots have sold for in the area over the past 6 to 12 months. But even that doesn't exist a lot of times. I mean, it's very common that you'll find a 5 acre parcel of land, and it's literally one of a kind. Like there's nothing else like it anywhere nearby. So you have to start making a lot of assumptions and maybe breaking it down on a per acre basis and comparing it to other properties that are a different size and dividing those by, just weird stuff to try to back into a number that you think it might be worth. And even professional appraisers a lot of times will tell you, like, we don't really know what we're doing either. Like we also don't have the data. So we can like try to give you an idea and show you our math and show you our license and all this stuff. But like, it doesn't mean it's right. It just means they chose certain comps and hopefully those are right. So, but in terms of the end use, usually these are being sold, I guess with the ones I deal with, they're usually being sold to residential people who want to possibly build a house there, possibly build a cottage there in the future, maybe use it as recreational land or camp there on the weekends. Kind of depends on what you're allowed to do with each individual property. But given that that is typically the end use in mind, I'm looking to make sure, okay, can this property be used to build a home? Like, is there enough surface area? Like, given the setbacks and the building requirements, like, can that stuff be done? And there's definitely properties out there that are truly useless. Like, you can't do anything on it. Maybe it's too small, or it's landlocked, or it's covered in wetlands. And it's kind of interesting. Those properties will still sell too, but it's going to be harder to find buyers. You're going to be selling it for a much lower price usually. And so that's why on the front end, before you buy a piece of vacant land, there's lots of critical due diligence you want to do to make sure, can this thing actually be used for the way that I think it can when I try to sell this? Because if it can't, you better believe it's going to have a huge impact on what you can sell that for and how long it's going to take to sell it.
Yeah, and that brings up a really good point. With the traditional brick and mortar real estate investing strategy, whether that be, flex office, retail, multifamily, self-storage, et cetera, oftentimes there's a value add component to that type of investment strategy, especially if it's not ground up development, right? Mm-hmm. So with acquiring dirt, I would assume that in some cases there is an opportunity, for some value add, some forced appreciation.
Yeah. Yeah. And the funny thing about land is that the buyer's perception has a lot to do with how much they're willing to pay for that. And given that the appraised value is kind of squirrely and it's hard to really nail down an objective price for what this thing is worth, I mean, you might find like one buyer in the world who will pay a lot more than anybody else will, just because, like, for example, I've got a couple acres behind my house that's wooded. It's beautiful. I don't own it. The neighbor, kitty corner down the road, owns that property. And funny thing is, like, this land is landlocked. Like, the only people who can get to it is them and me. And you better believe if they ever put that thing up for sale, I would pay a lot for it, but nobody else in the world would care about it. So it's that kind of thing where there's either that kind of just realistically, it's worth more to some people than others, or a lot of people, the reason that they're buying land, it's not because it logically makes sense. What they're buying into is this dream or this idea that I want to own land on a lake somewhere where I can take my grandkids there when I get older and build my cottage. And these are great ideas, but the reality is they're probably not actually going to do that. And they don't realize that until 20 years after they buy the thing. And then they get a letter from me and I buy it from them for really cheap. So it's kind of thing where if you can take a property and make it look a lot better with really good pictures, give it a really good description, list out all the realistic things you can do with that property, post it in as many places as possible, pick up the phone and call certain people if you know they might be interested in it, you can sell a property for a lot more than, say, if you just, give it to an agent who doesn't even put their sign on it and they post it with no pictures. Has a lot to do with the effort you put into marketing that thing.
Yeah. Seth, I want to talk about the bad news, good news. So I'm going to start with the bad. Yeah. The bad is we know that investing in land can be risky. So how do you manage or mitigate against that potential risk?
Yeah. Well, most of the risk in buying land is kind of like you alluded to earlier. It's on the front end when you make that acquisition, like paying the right price for it. And in order to pay the right price, you've got to understand its value. In order to understand its value, you have to really understand what can I or can I not do with this property? Like, and really what this boils down to is due diligence. And land has a lot of weird things that can be kind of hidden that you aren't going to jump out to you. And these are things that house investors don't even need to think about because these things have already been answered. Like, for example, in a lot of parts of the Southwest U.S., access to water is a huge problem. And if there's a house there already, that question's already been answered. There's water. That house has access to water. But a land investor, they have to lift up certain rocks and look underneath them to make sure that's actually true. They might have to make some calls and figure out, are there water utilities in the area? Do I have to drill a well? If so, what's that going to cost me? Is that going to cost $70,000? Because that totally changes everything. Or in places like Minnesota and Michigan and Wisconsin, perk tests are a really big deal where, if a property doesn't have access to a municipal sewer system, they need to make sure that the soil on that property perks or percolates so that the water drains through the soil at a fast enough rate. And if it doesn't, that means you can't put a septic system there. And if you can't do that, that means you can't build a house there. So all of a sudden, the property is not useful for what you thought it was. So in getting a perk test, it's kind of a pain. It costs money, takes time to do it. It's usually at least a few $100, depending on the area where you are working, sometimes thousands. And these are just little quirks that if you know what to look for, if you know how to get these answers, it's not that hard. But these are things that are very easy to get lazy about. And I've seen it happen many times. I've been guilty of this before, where you're just trying to get the thing done. You just want to close it. Like, it's probably fine. I'm sure there's no issues with it. And sometimes you can get away with that, for sure. I don't mean to say that that's, this horrible cardinal sin to do that, but the less you really verify these things and are absolutely sure about it, you just have to be aware, like, you're opening yourself up to risk. And I think what most people do is when they get working on bigger and bigger deals, like when it's worth 50,000 or 100,000 or $500,000 or 3 million, like, the higher the stakes are, the more it's worth your while and your money to, verify these things and get these answers and leave no questions unanswered, because a little issue like that can screw up a whole lot of stuff if you don't really know that.
Yeah. Well, those are all really great points. Let's shift gears here and talk a little bit about the some of the maybe the success stories. Do you have a particular successful land investment deal and what made that deal a success?
Yeah, sure. Well, for me, I'm not a big deal in terms of as far as doing huge deals. I'm kind of risk averse. I'm sort of skittish, like little things scare me. So, I mean, a normal deal for me would be one where I'm maybe paying like $10,000 and selling it for $30,000. Like, that's a normal base hit for me. Or, a deal that would be like particularly good, like what I consider a home run, would be one where maybe I'm paying $5,000 and selling it for $50,000. So just a really big percentage ROI on that. Or maybe like there was one deal, it's the fastest deal I think I've ever sold, where I paid $500 for it and then sold it for $25,000 in the span of 23 hours. So it was just like boom, boom, huge profit. It's not normal. I wouldn't expect that ever, but like that kind of stuff can happen. And, other people in our community do stuff much bigger. Like there's, these hero stories I hear about people making like literally millions buying a property for maybe like $700,000 and then subdividing it and then selling it off in a bunch of different parcels, and it's making a ton of money on this stuff. And when you get into that, again, it's kind of a different business model, because you can pay a lot more for properties based on their actual market value, because it's going to become worth a lot more. You're looking more at the future value than the value today. And it also takes a lot more time in different areas of expertise to do that. But that's certainly like a sub niche of land investing that you can do if you want to get into that.
Now, I know that you're primarily doing smaller deals, but maybe others that are in the same, business. What types of methods or ways are people financing these deals, and maybe what approach do you typically take?
Yeah. Well, for me, I've never had a loan for any of my properties. I just use my own cash. And that's kind of the benefit you get when you focus on those, I wouldn't say super small deals, but not the huge ones. If you want to make like millions at this, if you want to do that whole subdividing thing, there's certainly banks out there that will talk to you. Usually the smaller community banks that will do loans on those kind of things, where they understand your business model and they understand the future value, and they know that there's plenty of demand for those child parcels that you create. Like they have the data to know, like, if this thing is subdivided, it will actually sell, because we have the data to prove that. And that's true in some markets and it's not true in others. So it kind of depends on the market you're in. Another thing that people will do is they will work with like a land funder. And this is something that didn't exist back when I started this. But as this, small industry has evolved, there's been a lot of people who have learned the land business, but they're like, I don't actually want to do this. I just want to like help other people and fund their deals and then split the profit with them, or in some way share in those profits. So there's plenty of funders out there who will basically just sign a JV agreement with you, or a partnership agreement, and they'll front all the cash and then you do all the work. And then when you do the work and sell the thing, you have to send half the profits or 40% or 30% to them. And there's all kinds of different ways to negotiate this. I've seen many different ways to have it split up. Some funders will take mortgages on the property. Some want the property titled in their name. So it just kind of depends on the funder you're working with, but that's another way you could potentially work through it.
Most of the listeners of this podcast are passive real estate investors.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to that listener of this episode that wants to get started in land investing? Where would they go to start to learn more?
Yeah. Well, I'd say it's not passive at all. So if that's what you're expecting, don't do this. Maybe you could be a funder, that kind of thing. But if you do want to get your feet wet, so RE Tipster, I've spent what is it now? 12 years, something like that, putting together free content all about this on retipster.com. There's literally spent thousands of hours making blog posts and videos. And every time that I make this content, my objective is this needs to be so good it's worth paying for, but it's free. So seriously, if you want to learn all about this, if you go to landflippinglifecycle.com, that will forward you to a blog post I wrote that kind of gives a little mini course on how this whole business model works. It's like a 20-minute video explaining everything. So there's that. If you do want a full A to Z, course on how all this stuff works, you could go to landinvestingmasterclass.com. That's a course that I've had out there for a number of years now. I update it all the time. And that's also a course that explains the whole thing, how this all works.
That's great. What, just out of curiosity, are there any other asset classes that you personally focus on from a real estate investing perspective outside of land investing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been getting into self-storage investing. I just built my first facility and we opened it up about 6 months ago. Took me about 2 years to do that. And honestly, I think every land flipper should be actively trying to work themselves out of the land business. And the reason I say that is the land investing business, or at least the land flipping business, is a very active business. It's kind of like a hamster wheel, but it's a hamster wheel that pays really, really well. Because of how well it pays, it's an amazing cash generating machine that can help you invest in other stuff a lot faster than if you're just depending on your day job. But it takes a lot of work. And if you want those huge profits to keep coming in, it's a very active business. And personally, I want the ability to take my foot off the gas at some point. Not saying I don't like what I'm doing, but if the day ever comes and it's I just want a break and I want the money to keep coming in and I want some tax breaks too. That's what, for me, self-storage investing is all about. And for other people, it might be triple net lease buildings or residential rental properties, something like that. But I would say to any land investor who starts to get successful and make hundreds of thousands of dollars, actively try to put that somewhere else in some kind of buy and hold investment, because it's just a good long-term plan, I think.
Sure. What's next for Seth Williams, either personally or professionally?
Yeah, good question. I've never been great at making 5-year plans, but I'd love to get a few more self-storage facilities. And RE Tipster is a ton of fun. That's where I spend probably 80% of my week doing most of my work. And I really love it. It's awesome. So probably keep doing that as long as it's fun, and do whatever land deals I can fit in there in the meantime.
I would be doing you a disservice to not ask the question about RE Tipster. What is it, and what will we find if we go there?
Sure. Yeah. So RE Tipster, it was kind of my response after going through a number of different courses and kind of just seeing what the standard was out there for a lot of educational courses, and realizing it wasn't totally unhelpful, but there were a lot of things left unanswered. A lot of things that I kind of had to struggle with to figure out, okay, how does this actually work? I hear your sales pitch, but what's the ugly underbelly of this that I have to figure out for myself? And tons and tons of different things I had to work through to figure that stuff out. And I wanted to let the world know about that stuff and show them I have nothing to sell you here. This is just what my experience was. And these were the different things I figured out on how to get through that stuff. And a lot of the content on RE Tipster is just that. It's kind of like my way of giving back, I guess, to the RE Tipster, or the, real estate community as a whole, really. And the reason it's able to, it's been able to survive for so long is, first of all, because I enjoyed it, but also because I've been able to find creative ways to monetize it over the years in ways that don't require you to pay me money to keep doing it. Like, we do a lot of affiliate reviews. So, for example, like if I use a certain software or phone service or website maker or whatever, I give you a tour on like, here's what I'm using, here's how I'm using it, here's what I do and don't like about it. If you want to check it out, here's an affiliate link. You don't have to. There's plenty of other options, but there you go. And that kind of thing works surprisingly well. It takes a lot of work to make that kind of money, but like when you do enough of it and when you enjoy it, it can actually become a nice stream of income.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to go check out RE Tipster when we wrap up this episode. But what would maybe be one or two other ways that our listening audience can connect with you to learn more about what you're up to?
Sure. Well, if you go to retipster.com and scroll to the bottom, there's a footer area where there's a contact button where you can reach out to me if you want, or if you're on any social media platform, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or LinkedIn, just look for RE Tipster and you'll find me there. There's also the RE Tipster podcast. That's out there too. So yeah, just do some searching for RE Tipster and you'll probably find our stuff wherever you're at.
Well, Seth, I've really appreciated having you join us on the show today.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
And listening audience, thank you again for joining another episode of The Freedom Point. We look forward to having you join us on the next episode.
Thank you for hanging out with us today and for listening to the Freedom Point podcast, powered by Starting Point Capital. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on this show should be considered financial advice. Before making any financial decision, please consult with a professional. This show is copyrighted by the Freedom Point podcast. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting. If you're interested in connecting, you can find contact information at startingpointcapital.com.